Okay, right, I'll hand over to so you work at the Centre for Research in Digital Education, which I think you were just telling me is quite new.
Relatively new, yes. It was launched late last year, I think, up in Edinburgh. So
Okay.
it's a centre where we brought together various research agendas around digital education. So there's 4 strands to that centre. There's a learning analytics strand, a digital cultures strand, which I work in. There's a children and technology strand, and there's a policy strand. So all those things relating to digital education.
Excellent. And you're going to talk to us today about posthumanism, digital education, and the MOOC.
I hope so.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I'll hand over to you.
Okay, I'll stand just to do a bit of the performative. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Talk I thought I would go through today is posthumanism, digital education, and the MOOCs. And MOOCs, and what I guess I want to do today is, first of all, tackle this term posthumanism, which is a term for a set of theories or a theoretical lens or a way of understanding philosophy and theory that I think is quite useful for education in general, digital education specifically. And what I want to do in part of this talk, probably most of it, if I can get through it, is try to bring some of that theory down and apply it to something very specific in digital education, MOOCs, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with, this audience is familiar with what MOOCs are, perhaps the most prominent and kind of mainstream example of digital education most recently. So I've said I'm from this relatively new Centre for Research in Digital Education, so I'm sort of doing a bit of promotion for that as well when I do some talking. So this is where I want to begin with this kind of problematic term posthumanism that I've found useful in some of my research, but it is a term that I don't think has really gained much traction in education, although I think there is some very good work where people are using this theory to look at education and digital education, education technology, and use it as a lens, as a way of generating productive ideas and new insights about what we mean when we talk about education and the humans involved in it, and specifically for digital education, the kind of technologies that are involved in that mix. But it is a problematic term, and I think it's, in my experience, is a term that gets a bit of resistance in certain circles, and it is a term that I think needs careful explanation and a bit of attention to do that. So I think this bit I'm going to try and necessarily move through this, I guess, quite quickly, and mostly it will be just to signal some of the key literature which I think is in this area, and to talk about positions that various authors and various people working in this general area of posthumanism take. One of the key texts for me is Neil Badminton's collection of essays published in 2000. For me, that was one of really the first texts that took a position and claimed this term of posthumanism. There's a sort of significance to this term, which I'll try and get onto. Of course, is the post, the human, and the ism. You know, those are actually quite key to understanding what it is, and I'll get on to that. But I think what's very important and useful about this quote I have on the screen here from Badminton points to the sort of problematic nature of the term, and also the term it's referring to, and I think that's the key point here. So what he says is posthumanism is a convenient shorthand for a general crisis and something that we must helplessly call humanism. So there's a few things in there that I just want to pick up on. A convenient shorthand, meaning that it's a term for something that is multiple, and it's a kind of term we necessarily have to use to mean multiple things, and that's why I actually think it's a bit of a problematic term, which I'll come on to, but I do think it's a term that has some uses. So I suppose the thing to say there is that in my work I certainly don't, it's not about advocating posthumanism as a new way to look at education, something that replaces old ways. It's a theoretical lens to hold to critical account. I think the quotes around we in this sentence is points to the general thrust of what posthumanism is, which questions who the we are when we say human beings, humanism, we, this group of people. It's questioning the boundaries, where those boundaries are drawn around humans and non-humans. But importantly, I think this is why I've actually got this quote, is the second part of the sentence, must just as helplessly call humanism. Because the problem with humanism, the term posthumanism, is it's trying to theoretically address the area of humanism. So before we even get to posthumanism, I think what we have to do is talk about humanism. But of course, that's a problematic term in itself, and that's one of the reasons I think why posthumanism itself as a theoretical area has come under some critique. I think the best work on humanism that's been out for some time is Tony Davies' Humanism. I think what he really gets across in this text is a very short text that some of you, I guess, might have read. What he really gets across in this text is the different eras, the different ethical perspectives, the different philosophies, the different philosophers, the different historical periods which have sort of claimed and shaped this term humanism. So it's a term that's used a lot, but it's a term that means very different things depending on the different kind of historical period we're talking about. People often equate it with the Renaissance in Europe. It's often equated with things like the Enlightenment, Romanticism, kind of 20th century modernism. But I think what Davies really shows in this text is the sort of nuanced positions and the different kind of humanisms that are produced in those eras. We might look at an example of the difference between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which are quite often equated. But of course, the Renaissance was looking backward. The Renaissance was looking to early Greek culture as the sort of source of humanism, while the Enlightenment was about generating the new and was in some ways separating humans from religion, is how it's often portrayed. What I want to do is this is an area that deserves a lot of attention in itself, but what I've done in my work and what others have done as well is to try and break down, despite these differences in what humanism is, try and break it down into some key ideas that are shared across these different humanisms. And two of those are described here as a top quote from Davies, Essentialism and Universalism. So what he says is, humanism we might call it the myth of essential and universal man. Essential because humanity or humanness is the inseparable and central essence, the defining quality of human beings. Universal because that essential humanity is shared by all human beings of whatever time or place. So what Davies is trying to do is critique this idea that there's something innate, something natural to the human condition, which is within all of us. It's the nature-nurture debate, that there is something natural before nurture. But also universalism is the idea that is shared amongst everyone in the species. And he calls that out as a particular idea from humanism. I want to sort of add one to that, and I think he sort of does as well, which is autonomy. So this is the idea, I think it's a particularly humanist idea, that this innate humanness that we have within us is something that is that can be cultivated and produce who we are without relations to other things. Autonomy is independence and self-direction. I think that's something that we can read in across the different humanisms. So, a problematic definition of humanism, but nonetheless, I think one that we can work with. And I think Steve Fuller it probably best defines humanism as a concept defined in retrospect, and that's sort of what people are doing with humanism. Very briefly, the other important thing I want to signal in this general area of theory is the tight coupling of humanism and education, and that's something that I've made the case for in other work. If we look at some of the key figures in these different historical areas of humanism, we quite often find writing in their writing that they tie their ideas very clearly to education. Kant wrote about education very specifically. This was the thing that, to sort of paraphrase that, education was necessary to sort of calm the wild natural state of human beings and to employ reason. Because of course Kant was about reason. Reason was acquired through education, and reason was the route to achieving a sense of being human. Of course, Rousseau and Emile was the sort of post-Enlightenment romantic idea of education. The bringing out of the innate character of individuals was the task of education, to achieve this cultivated sense of what it means to be human. And I think that can also be traced in 20th century with the sort of science of the mind, psychology, big figures like Maslow and Rogers, which are tying this idea of what the mind is and what it means to be human to a kind of educational process of something like the hierarchy of needs. This is a great book by Robin Usher and Richard Edwards, which is about postmodernism in education, but postmodernism is probably not a term to get into today. But what they describe there is education as the dutiful child of the Enlightenment. So in that analysis, what they're doing is tying ideas of education very clearly to these movements that we associate with humanism. Another good work that develops this idea is a set of papers by Helena Pedersen, who normally works in the kind of animal studies area, which is another area of posthumanism. But what she talks very, very well about is how human beings are both the instrument and the end product of education. Human beings are what we work with when we do education, but also they're the end product. The subject is what we want to achieve when we do education. So that's a bit of a sort of very quick rattling through of what humanism is. To sum that up, a sort of problematic area of a number of different theories that can coalesce around a set of ideas: a universal human condition, an innate or essential humanness, and the idea that we are autonomous and independent from the things around us. And I think while those are problematic, that if we agree that they are problematic, it is a theoretical area like critical posthumanism, which can step in and hold some of those things to account. And I think that's what some work in critical posthumanism does. This is really just to signal some key texts which I think are important in this area. I've already mentioned Badminton's Posthumanism, which is a collection of essays which really make the case for that term, posthumanism. Very recently, Rosie Braidotti, who is a feminist and a sort of new materialist scholar, has written quite an accessible book called The Posthuman, which I'll come on to a little bit later. And a key one for the connection with technology is Catherine Hale's How We Became Posthuman. And that's actually an important point to make the distinction between posthuman and posthumanism, and to say what I think is going on in the difference between those terms. Because for me, posthumanism, the post must be understood in the same way that we understand the post of postmodernism. It's a critique. It's a holding to account of humanism. So posthumanism is a critical analysis of what we understand humanism to be, because it's the ism that we're getting at there. I think that's very different from some of the ways that posthumanism is often interpreted as a critique of just the human or the human being. I think it is very specifically directed at humanism. There isn't many works in this area which are calling into question the category of human being. Nobody's questioning that we are human beings and we are in education. But what they are questioning are these central ideas of a normative figure of a human being within that. I think it's also important to make the distinction between posthumanism and transhumanism, which is another area of theory which you may have come across this term, which I see more clearly linked to humanism, and that's about enhancing the normative idea of the human through technology. So a lot of these terms are sometimes conflated, but the one I want to sort of signal for the work I do is critical posthumanism, holding to account, critically assessing the idea of a normative human being. So I'll try and say a little bit more about that as I sort of bring this rather esoteric theory down to earth, as I'll try to do shortly. It's also important to say that posthumanism isn't anti-humanism, so it's not against humanism. In fact, a lot of the work, Braidotti included, try to do things that are quite humanist. Rosie Braidotti, I think, sort of believes in emancipation. She believes in justice, although she might not use the term justice. So it's an area of theory that doesn't see itself as rejecting those things in humanism. Those things I talked about, there's a universal thing that unites all human beings. We are autonomous. We can self-direct. And there is an essence to us. It doesn't necessarily reject those things. It holds them to critical account. That's where I see the value of critical posthumanism as being. And I think, as I signaled in the abstract, there's a useful connection here in Braidotti's work to some of the other areas of theory like postcolonialism. That's something I want to draw on when we talk about MOOCs. I think she has a wonderful turn of phrase in her writing, Rosie Braidotti, when she's talking about humanism. She says, it's a delusion of grandeur in positing ourselves, and that's my emphasis there, as the moral guardian of the world and as the motor of human evolution. So what she's doing here is aligning that model of a normative human, a normative model of who we are as distinctly European. So it's aligning with all of those historical areas and philosophers and ethical movements that I talked about previously, European Enlightenment, the Renaissance, ancient Greek culture, all of those things as producing in different forms a normative European model of humanness and exporting that through a process of colonization. So that's the way I see that theory is linked to some of the post-colonial critique. So I think it's worth trying to bring some of that theory down to talking specifically about digital education and MOOCs, which I'll sort of try to do, but I guess some of it might still remain at a different level. So what I want to try and make the case for is that those ideas are a useful theoretical lens to hold to account the way we think about digital education and MOOCs specifically. Essentialism, universalism, autonomy, those are the sort of ideas I want to work with. And through this idea of holding those things to account, show that those ideas are present within the ways MOOCs have been marketed and practiced, developed, and taught. So we might think of essentialism here, of course, as this core humanness and that's linked to the autonomy theme there. This humanness is something that is brought out, something that is latent within us, innate within us, and is brought out through education. A commitment to universalism, that's something very humanist, and I think we see this in MOOCs particularly as this justification of a global desire for education, specifically from elite universities or Western institutions. We'll get onto that in a moment. And in a particular sort of late 20th century vein of humanism, I think we can really sense this idea of autonomy and self-direction when we look at digital education in general and MOOCs. This idea, this humanist idea, as being the ultimate educational aim. We're not really learning content. We're learning about ourselves, our own predilections within the kind of information and the content that we come across. And the ultimate goal is to learn to self-direct, to learn to learn. Okay, so MOOCs. I'm sure everyone is sort of roughly aware of what I mean when I say MOOC. Massive open online course. These are these very big one version of them was a very popular and mainstream idea of an fully online course, which I guess achieved mainstream attention in around 2012, 2013. And this is an example of some of the headlines that we were seeing in the media and some of the educational kind of media about these courses, claiming the end for traditional higher education, educational revolution, the future, these kind of extreme terms for promoting what these courses were going to achieve. So I think they are a useful example of digital education to talk about some of these humanist terms, simply because they were perhaps achieved a mainstream kind of notoriety that digital education, distance education, e-learning, however you want to call it, hadn't achieved necessarily in the same way before that. Despite this sort of period of hype around 2012, 2013 that I'm talking about, it might be argued that MOOCs aren't going away, so it could be that they are still important things to talk about. This is an article from earlier this year in the Chronicle of Higher Education showing the number of MOOCs started. So that's up to predicting 3,800 in February 2016. It may well have gone over 4,000 by now. So these, despite this, some of this critical discourse that was happening around MOOCs when they arrived, there is a sense that they are here, still here in some form, and still very popular. This slide, I think, I use as an example of the ways that MOOCs achieved a kind of mainstream awareness that other digital educational projects hadn't, because this is one of the founders of Coursera, Daphne Koller, who's a machine learning professor at Stanford University, and this is her talking about Coursera at the G8 Innovation Conference in the UK. So this is a high-profile international political kind of platform in which somebody is talking about digital education. So I think that really gets across not only the mainstream attention that was given to MOOCs, but the promotional machinery that was behind this idea of online revolution, which I want to get into now. So if I can fit it in the time, I want to talk about these three themes as a way of talking about MOOCs and sort of critically analysing what has happened in this MOOC space, and hopefully drawing on some of this idea of critiquing a humanist way of viewing what education is. The corporate promotion, which I've just, I think, alluded to in those couple of slides, corporate promotion of MOOCs, how we understand the space of MOOCs, and what MOOCs are spatially. I think that has connotations for digital education in general. And also, this is an area I'm increasingly trying to work in at the moment, is the role of data capture analysis and algorithms in online education, and how that challenges some of the humanist values that underpin MOOCs specifically. So in terms of the promotion of these organizations, certainly when they were first the platform MOOCs of organizations like Coursera, and this one is from another organization called Udacity, when they first came to mainstream attention, I think they still do this to a certain extent, they were prefaced with these big kind of mission and visionary statements. And for me, this signaled that the promotional machinery as being very much situated in a sort of very clearly humanist idea of what education is. So Udacity's mission was to bring accessible, affordable, engaging, and highly effective higher education to the world. Coursera had a vision of empowering people with education that will improve their lives, the lives of the families and the communities they live in. Nothing wrong with making those bold claims, but I think with a sort of critical hat on, and this is where I draw again on the work of Davies, that as he says, revolutions are made in the name of not you or me, but of humanity. I think we need to remain critical of the kind of assumptions, and I think humanist assumptions, that underpin these sort of bold claims. And the sort of bold claims that we see corporations, the sort of corporate response to education that these MOOC organizations embody taking on. My question is just who is the humanity that they are assuming exists? What is the boundary they're drawing around it? I think it's fairly obvious they're drawing the boundary around everyone in the world, and we'll come back to this idea of the globe and of the world because it's a key symbol in the way that MOOCs have been promoted. But also, what do we mean if we do take on this idea that education is tightly coupled with humanism? What is the humanity that's the end product of MOOCs? What is the kind of humanness that we are supposed to achieve when we've gone through the mill of the MOOC experience and come out the other end as a subject educated through this particular mode? So, of course, these big level, these high level missions and visions are also coupled, sort of in a way that I think attempts to justify them, is coupled with stories from students. I guess to balance that out, this one from Udacity is a student with a story that they have landed their dream job through studying a particular course on that Moodle platform. edX, this is another MOOC organization, which is a partnership between, on the East Coast, between MIT and Harvard. And this is a page that was on their website, which had student stories. So students who were contributing stories about how they had taken a MOOC and found it very successful for whatever educational goals they had in mind. Note also the map of the world that you might be able to see there, showing the location. So again, we have this idea that the globe is the legitimate territory for what MOOC education is. So these stories may well be very legitimate and fine, but I think they do need to be recognized as highly selective and part of the promotional machinery that MOOCs are engaged in. This is just a quick one, and this is something that I analyze a little bit more in the book. I should have mentioned the book. There is a book. We'll come back to the book, which most of this stuff comes from. And this is a promotional video from edX, and it's a sequence where it shows a number of different students who have taken their course and claim to have had a wonderful experience of it. My little sort of kind of discursive analysis of this sequence is just to say that the location is in a much bigger font than the name. Small point, but I think it's illustrative of a larger discursive gesture by these organizations, which is about promotion. We're not really too concerned who Miriam is, but what the audience must know is that this educational broadcast has reached Argentina. I think that's the main message that we're supposed to get from that. A couple of other scenes here from that same promotional image, and they come in sequence. This is 11 seconds and 12 seconds. Is a student supposedly studying in a wonderful scenery using a laptop, and a group of students studying around a computer. And I think the promotional gesture that is trying to be conveyed here is flexibility. One can learn MOOCs wherever you are. You can be sitting on a hillside with a wonderful view. As long as you have an internet connection, must be very good Wi-Fi, you're going to be able to access this education. Flexibility, equality, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in the world, you are going to be able to access the same education. With a critical lens on this kind of promotional material, we might look at the way Braidotti describes this sort of this humanist vein as a hastily reconstructed sense of the pan-human bond induced by globalization. For me, this is a hasty connection, as if these things are suddenly make all the problems of educational access okay. The privileged laptop user who has their own machine, and shall we say the less privileged group of students who are having to share machines which are clearly not of the same technical specification. And that's one of the sort of links to some of the broader critique of MOOCs that I get onto in the but one of which is, of course, that it assumes an equitable material internet infrastructure underneath. The very fact that these students, they're trying to portray them as a non-Western group of students, the very fact that they're sharing computers is because there is not, I would suggest, not the Wi-Fi infrastructure within the country that I think continent I think they're alluding to that would support video streaming, which is the main content in MOOCs. So again, I think this is feeding off the particular kind of theoretical lens I've been trying to apply to this, which is thinking of a normative idea of the human as something that is Europe, and I'm sort of using Europe here to mean a sort of Western idea of education, because this is the humanist critique that Braidotti is surfacing. Humanism, being European, is a concrete geopolitical location and a specifically grounded history, which is transformed into an abstract concept and a normative ideal that can be implemented across space and time. So the connection I'm trying to make here is that MOOCs are doing this transportation of a normalized idea of human being in a new way, because they do have a global kind of access. You can access these courses from, and in many ways that's a good thing, from all these different locations, that MOOCs are involved in a new way of transporting, implementing an idea of humanism across space and time that perhaps hasn't been achieved before. And of course, what MOOCs are involved in most definitely is this idea of spreading across the world. And for certainly in the early days of the MOOCs, what that meant is getting numbers of students. And we can see this very clearly when we look at some of the promotional material. This is the Coursera homepage, which clearly displays the number of Courserians, or the number of people who are enrolled on Coursera. This is from some time ago. It's 6 million. I think they're way beyond that. So they're very proud of promoting the idea that they're reaching 6 million people. There's a number of reasons for that, which I'll get on to some others in a moment. But there's a expansionist, territorialist drive, I think, within these organizations who are competing for students. This one, I think, is from FutureLearn, which is, this was after I signed up to the discovery of the Higgs boson, which was the European MOOC, and this one was encouraging me to share this signing up with friends, family, and colleagues. So there was this drive to get more enrollments. That's what these MOOCs were interested in. And this was one from edX, which was received in an email. This is from some time ago, I think it was about 2013 or 14, which was proudly announcing that they were now 2 million students strong. So this was definitely the sort of definite kind of expansionist drive in MOOC promotion. So for me, those things seem to be very clearly aligned to a particular idea of humanism as a kind of colonial, expansionist gesture for a particular kind of education that assumes a normative model for what the subject or the learner might be. But I'm aware I've sort of rattled through that quite quickly. So the other theme where I think some of these theories are useful is also not just thinking about the corporate promotion of MOOCs, but the kind of space in which they're involved in. Because space seems to be a pretty problematic thing when we talk about what online education is. Again, working with a bit of the promotional machinery around MOOCs, I think MOOCs are very confused about what they perceive the space of the MOOC to be. And this is something which I'll get onto as an area which I think has been theorized much better outside of education. If we look at the institutional pages within these MOOC platforms, this one happens to be from University of Pennsylvania. We see the nice sort of antiquated facade of the institution there as promoting a kind of spatial idea of what you are experiencing when you take a University of Pennsylvania MOOC. And we see this across all the different institutional pages in Coursera and edX and some of the other platforms. Edinburgh is very much the same. This idea that if you take computer architectural algorithms part 1, you are engaging in some way in the authenticity, an authentic spatial educational engagement with Princeton University. But of course, the other side of MOOC promotion has also come out in research. And lots of the research that we saw in the early days of MOOCs was about showing the number of enrollments. And this is, if you were at all interested in MOOCs, you can't have missed the sort of heat map visualization of enrollments. And what it does is show a map of the world defined by nation states, and the hue within each nation state is darker according to the number of enrollees. The darker the hue, the more number of people are enrolled from that particular nation state. So at the same time as giving us information about who has enrolled in this one is from edX, who has enrolled in particular edX courses, I think it also communicates this kind of expansionist drive of these organizations. They want to show that they are achieving their mission and vision of attracting students from across the globe. But it also gives this idea of a flat surface of the world in which these MOOCs can be accessed. There's not much nuance here about the differences. I mean, we can see that the African continent is particularly light in shade, but there's not much nuance conveyed here about the different experiences that one might have taking a MOOC in these different places. The places in which we're in, I'm sure, do impact on the way we can understand the space of these courses. That's just an example of another one. The grey colour here perhaps showing in more contrast the significant lack of participation from the African continent, and this is from the Coursera platform. Slightly different one here, which is using the same geolocation process to identify where students are from in the globe. So, what I make the case for is that those two ideas coming from MOOC promotion and MOOC research tend to create these kind of dual and sort of problematic ideas of what the space of the MOOC is. And I think this is really comes across in this visualization from Coursera very well, because it shows the same heat map. This time it's in a spherical globe visualization rather than a flat one, but it also shows the institutions. So it shows this difference between the awaiting population, desperate for the kind of education that these MOOC platforms can provide, and the location of the institutions. This is, again, in the early days. I think the map would be slightly different now, but I think it would still be heavily weighted towards institutions being in the global north, and particularly in the North American continent and Europe. So what it shows is a sort of problematic way of understanding space, the institution and the globe, and nothing in between. What it also shows is, I think, the mode of a kind of broadcast pedagogy that we've seen in the platform-based MOOCs, because, as I'm sure most of you will be aware, the primary content in those courses are video lectures, with little opportunity for dialogue. Well, certainly the emphasis is on the core content coming from those prestigious institutions and being broadcast to the awaiting populace. Of course, that's not the only way we can understand what MOOCs are, and indeed the sort of spatial configuration of MOOCs. And as I think I alluded to earlier, there is another categorization of MOOCs, and indeed another area of research and teaching from which the term MOOC was actually coined, and I'm sure most of you will be aware of that. The Canadian group of researchers interested in network learning, who coined the term MOOC in their experimentations with a proposed theory of learning called connectivism, George Siemens, Stephen Townsend, Dave Cormier. And that is as I'm sure many of you will know, who are more versed in the idea of connectivism, will know that the idea of the network sort of underpins the learning theory there and the way that the course is arranged. So rather than a central platform broadcasting prestigious content to awaiting students, the model of the sort of space of the course there is something more akin to a network, and this is a network diagram that Stephen Downes, I think, produced in relation to that first MOOC. So I think the important point to make here is that we need theories of these complex spatial relations to try and get at how we can understand the space of MOOCs and more generally the space of online education. I don't think the promotion of the campus or the idea of a sort of flat map of global participation really get at what it is to experience education at a distance mediated through technology. And I think it's other areas of theory which seem to be getting at the spatial in a much clearer way. And there are sets of theories which I sort of roughly put under the umbrella of posthumanism, and these are a couple of figures. John Law particularly works with actor network theory and other things which try to work with notions of absence and presence, not things that are opposed. And I would just want to quickly signal a project by colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, which I think sort of started to work with that in a bit more of an interesting way. They were again working with maps of the world. So this is the MSc in digital education, which colleagues teach on. So it's a fully online program, nowhere near the size of a MOOC, but we do get students from enrolling from different places in the world. And what this project did was try to find out about the experiences and the sort of spatial dynamics of the places in which people were studying courses at Edinburgh. So rather than thinking about the campus and images of the campus as the ways to portray what the Edinburgh experience was, we invited students to send in images or videos or things which portrayed what Edinburgh was for them. This one was somebody sitting in their high-rise apartment in Seoul, and they described, this video described how this is the seat that they use. I think it's an IKEA chair which he really liked, and that was his place where he would look out the window and engage with the material. So that space was, for him, part of enmeshed, embroiled in the kind of Edinburgh experience. And the images of the campus and the sort of 18th century architecture of Edinburgh didn't mean as much to him for his learning experience as that. This one was a walk in the Australian outback to think about things on the course, and this one was a video of a sort of noisy urban flat in Mexico. And that work was came out of a general other project which that team were involved in, which was which some of you may be aware of, is a manifesto for teaching online, which was trying to create a number of sort of provocative statements that were challenging some of the ideas that seem to still be maintained about distance and digital education. And this is one of the ones that I always turn to, which is online can be the privileged mode. Distance is a positive principle, not a deficit. And what I think that's trying to signal is the idea is that we can work with what distance is, rather than comparing it to campus as the sort of gold standard. Face-to-face is the gold standard, the authentic way of doing education. We can consider distance as actually something quite rich and something quite valuable. So that's the thing that I think MOOCs haven't really been able to work with, and I think it's something that needs more work. There are some really great MOOCs that do work with space in different ways. This is a fantastic MOOC called Modern and Contemporary American Poetry from the University of Pennsylvania. It's on the Coursera platform. I think a new instance has just started. This is Phil Rees, who's a Kelly Professor of English at Kelly Writers House. And this is a video still from a series of videos which were produced for that MOOC, in which he and his team of postgraduate students walk the audience through the interpretation of various modern and contemporary American poems. Very popular course, very well received, and in the book, I go through this course and analyze it as doing and saying very particular and interesting things about what the space of a MOOC and what the space of digital education might be. And one of the things I don't think I have a slide for is a really interesting video, if you do get to look at that MOOC, which is a video they did of a tour of the Kelly Writers House. The Kelly Writers House is a very interesting old building which sits on the campus of University of Pennsylvania. And one of the videos that was produced when you first go to that course was a tour of the building given by Alpha Reese when he walks around and introduces the various spaces and the various people. And I think what I was trying to do in the book was show how that was still, in a way, trying to work with space, but still in a way trying to privilege the Kelly's Writers' House as this kind of authentic place of education, which was something very different to the experience of space and the experience of educational place that students might be engaging in. And I end that chapter with this picture, which I found was one point where the digital seemed to come into the authentic campus place. And that's the sort of point I was trying to make in this campus, because what Al has done here is print out a forum from the MOOC. This is a discussion forum from the online course where these distance students are discussing, probably in a very highly engaged and informed way, the poems. And he's printed that out physically, and I think he's going to stick it on the wall in the Kelly Writers' House. So for me, that was a sort of seminal moment, because the digital was coming back into the institution. That's the general point I'm sort of trying to make, and also in this chapter, that the broadcast pedagogy of the MOOC doesn't do enough to bring the outside space, the spaces of real experience out there, back into the institution. What MOOCs do is hold the institution as an authentic place of education, and I think it needs to be sort of infected by these outside places in order for it to change productively, and that sort of seemed to signal that for me. So very briefly, in the last couple of minutes, I've been talking for some time. The other theme that I think is productive to look at is what I'm sort of calling algorithmic cultures, and this is another area which I'm working in at the moment and want to develop some more work in. And when I say the algorithmic, what I'm referring to there are algorithms, software routines, software instructions that operate in the kind of technology and in the software that we use for digital education. And the first thing to say there is that what the platform MOOCs were very successful at doing is capturing data. Algorithms only work when they have data to work with. And what I think I do in the book is talk about the term platform as doing two things: raising up the profile of these institutions so they can attract more students, but at the same time capturing the whole of the educational experience within one platform so that they can capture learner data. And of course, this is the thing that has led to one of the big drivers behind the field of learning analytics. When you have all this data, you can perhaps use particular techniques to try and make sense of what students are doing. Of course, this is what differentiated the platform MOOCs from the connectivist MOOCs, which were out on the public web and used networks, and it was much more difficult to capture that data. So this is the kind of thing that we saw in the early days of MOOC research, profiling students, capturing data about gender, nationality, educational background, and of course also capturing what students were doing within these platforms, storing that data and then using it for a kind of big data analysis for what students were doing. And of course that area has really been a huge sort of area of growth, I think, in digital education in recent years. An example of which is the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference, which was in Edinburgh this year, a sort of an area which is going from strength to strength, is analysing this data. So I know I'm sort of rattling through these last few slides, and the way I try to talk about that in this book is a notion of data colonialism. Coming back to the maps of the world, while they are interesting and they do show us participation from these various different nation states, I think what they are actually doing is showing us the extent of the data capture machinery that is within these platform systems. Because the data, as the sort of big data business analysts keep telling us, data is the new gold, I think, as it was described somewhere. I forget. Data is really the valuable thing in this kind of web economy. And that's would certainly explain why these organizations are intent on getting as many enrolled students as possible, because for each student they get more data and they technically own that data and can do things to it. So yeah, the sort of colonialism we need to understand with the MOOC isn't necessarily about territory; it's about the acquisition of data. And that leads me just very briefly to Signal e-learning in digital cultures, which was the MOOC that I designed and taught on the Coursera platform, which some of you may be aware of. The only thing here is to say that one of the things we did was not do video lectures, but we sort of embedded social media within that course rather than as a sort of way to try and challenge the centrality of the platform and trying to get people out using social media. And generally within that course there was a sort of theme of a cultural studies approach that we were trying to get across. I'll just flip that next one to get to the point of this, which is that we, in the various parts of this course, because we were using social media, we were actively working with algorithms that were underpinning the software we were using. This is a blog that we wanted students to blog in our MOOC, and this is a central blog which we sort of copied the idea from the connectivist MOOC guys who were very good at designing systems to bring different blog posts into one central blog space, and we did this with a WordPress site. So these are blog posts from different students which we were bringing into one space. But of course what was happening here, and I talk about this more in the book, is an algorithm was governing which posts appeared in the highest in the list. But of course this is an algorithm that most of us are aware of. Most websites and blogs and things function with the most recent post appearing at the top. But of course there's an algorithm that's governing that. Some of the more secretive algorithms that were underpinning what we were doing were also those in YouTube. This is the comment section in YouTube. We were using YouTube videos, so students were going into YouTube and they were commenting on those videos, and you can see that they were our students because they were leaving the course hashtag. But what's interesting here is that, especially since Google bought YouTube, there are very sophisticated algorithms that are underpinning this conversation and governing the order in which those conversations appear. They relate to who is in your social network if you're signed into the Google service, and they relate to all sorts of other things about who these people are. And of course the one that more people know about is the recommendation videos. The order of this list and what appears on this list is defined by an algorithm that nobody has access to. It's proprietary software that Google certainly wouldn't release. And it defines the order by the other videos you've watched, the other videos that other people have watched when they've watched that video, and the other people who are signed in your social network. So there's a very complex structure to the ordering of these videos, and what this screenshot shows is we were actually using this video as another resource on our MOOC, and what this screenshot shows is the influence of our course was actually bringing this video into association with this one, which we think was down to the fact that we had associated them on our MOOC. So that's the way that, kind of the way that one has to do a study of algorithms, is to try and reverse engineer them and try and work out what they're doing. But I suppose the general point I'm trying to make here is that in a general humanist kind of view and an idea of education which is underpinned by humanism, we tend to think that education is just about humans, just about individuals, either doing a course of learning to achieve something that's innate within them, or discussing things with other people and engaging in a kind of social construction of what knowledge is. And the argument I'm really trying to make in this general theme is that when we use social media, we are involving non-human agents which are might have been programmed by humans, but they don't do things that humans can predict. We're involving those agents in decision-making that affects the kind of communication that we're having. And those are sort of key examples there. That there's a non-human agency that's deciding the kind of links that a student might make. And very specifically here, deciding the flow of a conversation. So there seems to me to be something interesting there about sort of dominant social constructivism which we're using at the moment to understand how knowledge is produced, that seems to ignore the fact that on social media there are non-social things that are influencing, having some sort of influence in the construction of how a conversation like that might unfold. And I think the point is that may get more complex as we start using some of these social media type of algorithms in educational software. This is sort of the final slide, and it's just to show, these numbers are actually out of date, it's just to show the number of students enrolled just in MOOCs. I think there's over 30 MOOCs now at Edinburgh, compared to the campus enrollment. So we do have this sort of valuable and interesting MOOC thing going on, but also I think the sort of size we're talking about here, I guess the point I'm trying to make in this last section is this isn't just about the human sort of element in this massiveness of the MOOC. I think we need to look at all the other complex kind of things that are going on with the software as well, and recognize that in the way we understand what these courses are. That's the book that most of these sort of ideas have come from. It's not forthcoming, it's out. And it's with Routledge. I should have brought a copy along, but fortunately I didn't. That's all.
Anyway. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we've probably got lots of questions, but first of all, I want to say refill your glasses. Do help yourself to more refreshments, and we'll take, I think, a 5-minute break and just get all the windows open and the door. It's like a sauna in here, I think. So.
Is there a loo just around here?
I think the nearest one is probably just down this corridor. It's on the right. Yeah.
Okay.
Corridor, a few doors down. You've got a window near you. Please try and open it. This one's so. It's upstairs and on the next I'm going. There isn't.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you like Why is that? Really? Yeah. I mean, like,
always wanted to kind of like autumn. Where so the university goes, ooh, like heating on.
Yeah, I've got it all. It's like a sauna day. You walk outside and it's a fridge. It's not bad today, actually. It was this morning. It's cold yesterday. You still sign it and then?
Yeah.
Yeah, over coffee.
Well, I mean, I feel cold for the first 30 seconds and then,
Yeah,
after this,
and then boil it out, yeah.
some of my hands actually just because, you know, you hold the handlebar, they don't move.
Yeah,
17. Regular hours.
I might get to.
I know, I always skip on Wednesday. I could do the membership, but
Is that what it's alright?
I should do, yeah. I always keep saying I should.
Is that what it's alright?
Yeah. You can have more tea or coffee if you want.
Yeah, you're good. It's good.
I'm going out tonight.
Alright.
Yes. It's good. It's going. Yeah, that's right.
I think it's good.
Feel my brain.
It's very popular.
Yeah, I know, like
Edinburgh. On my holiday.
Oh, you were.
is it me or is it even?
About whether it's going forward or not.
And you, when is it now?
Rebecca?
Yeah.
She emailed. Has she? Rebecca? Rebecca, have you got a question?
No, I will tell you, I will go. If I have a question.
I never thought of that. Where is it? Yeah.
I went into asking something, perfectly normal, reasonable question.
Okay, should we make a start again?
And it was like,
Anybody can bear to the door closed? I could leave it open. Should we leave it open for a minute? Just alright. Can you leave it open and we'll close it if yeah. We'll close it if anybody comes and asks it. Have you mic on?
I do, but I turned it off.
I'm glad you did. We were just wondering about it.
So you just hold it, turn it back on?
Yeah,
then
that's
after that,
flash screen.
he felt
It's flashing me. Press it and then.
please.
Okay.
Green.
Yeah.
No, it's good.
All right, let's have some questions, please.
Visual cue.
Trying to get Natasha's attention here. Thank you. Okay, who wants to kick off with a question or a comment? Or are we all too hot? Just kind of begging. There was an awful lot of information there. It was really interesting. Oh, no.
Well, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about pace, actually. That's one aspect of posthumanism and everything else that you've been talking about in here. And all that geography, distribution of people. And there was one slide where we were seeing this person sitting in we're going to left and then the other group of people. So I thought actually they were just talking to each other in that exact moment. So that would also create a different kind of space. That would also change quite a lot of the space that we would know in a classical Western knowledge of what humanism or what the space is in relation to humanism. And if that post-humanism is criticism of the humanism, we would know how would that play out in this digital age that we have, and how would that look like from the post-humanist point of view?
Okay, so you mean if specifically digital?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I think that the point I try to make, I probably do it a lot better in writing than I do in speaking. But the point I think in that chapter is I try and make a sort of conceptual link between this idea of humanism and an idea of a kind of authentic and bounded space. That's maybe the bit that I didn't articulate all that clearly. But I think when we adhere to a particular idea of a subject, a bounded subject that's separate, meaning a human subject that's separate from the outside world and sort of autonomous from it, we are sort of adhering to that subject-object kind of division. That's normally the way we understand. That's the sort of grounding of philosophy, as a sort of subject-object division. But I think what that leads to is almost very directly is the idea of a privileging of presence and a deprivileging of absence. So that's the sort of link that I try to make, is that idea of being in place is defined by the boundaries of the subject. Place is privileged over space, place being bounded and located. So location is the privileging thing here. And I suppose what I'm drawing on there is a kind of post-structuralist idea of kind of terms, oppositional terms in which one is privileged and the other is deprivileged. Presence, absence, subject, object. Subject is privileged as the thinking, agential kind of element. Object, the stuff around us is passive, it can't act, those sorts of things. So presence and absence, presence is the thing that is privileged in humanism. And I think that directly leads to a kind of face-to-face being the authentic. So I think still within those two images, despite they were showing a kind of flexibility and equality, I think combined with, generally with MOOC promotion, the idea of what those students are getting is they might be accessing it from a beautiful location or from a group discussion somewhere else, but what they're accessing is the authentic place of the campus. So that's how I was that was the way I was sort of reading that promotional material, that it wasn't really engaging with what those spaces were, the problems and the advantages of both those different spaces. All they were really doing is showing, well, doesn't matter where you are, is actually irrelevant. I think that's the point I was trying to get across. It doesn't matter whether you're in a field, it doesn't matter whether you're in a non-Western country or a country of the global south. The point is you are still a Stanford student or a Harvard student or a sort of Princeton student. So that was the kind of reading I was doing of that promotional material. In terms of a sort of post-human spatial arrangement, I think that's maybe what I was trying to allude at with work that my colleagues were doing, where they were asking students, a sort of way towards that. I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think a way towards that is sort of to try and acknowledge what the specificities are of where people study. So rather than just homogenize everyone studying a MOOC from Lancaster as Lancaster students, try to bring in some of what is specific about their location back into the course in some way, to make that part of, in some way, what the spatial, involve that in the way that you promote and understand the spatial arrangement of the course. I suppose a simple way to do that would be not to use the facade of the institution as the way you promote what Edinburgh is, but use the locations of where the students are as part of that, and acknowledge the fact that most higher education institutions are these sort of do work with lots of distant students. There is a dynamic of absence and presence there, which can be very productive. Being away from the campus, being at the campus, visiting the campus, Skype calling the campus, those are more complex arrangements of space than just everybody sitting in a room. And that's the sort of privileged mode. Hope that sort of answered a little bit of that.
Follow up on that, please?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was very interesting and quite complex, and a lot of things that you actually combine. But if I follow up on that, do I understand correctly that you're mainly talking about the entry point to MOOCs, so the promotional side of it? Because if one looks at what's then actually happening to MOOCs, there's again a very interesting spatial relations in the sense of the completion rate, particularly the ones coming from, let's say, more disadvantaged spaces and places around the world tend not to complete those, and lately when they started introducing fees for the certificates. So this is again another sort of power relations, if you will, or reproduction of inequalities that then MOOCs get involved in. So this is my first question, and the question is just very interesting because you also touched upon big data, and data colonization that he used, and so on. But you never mentioned digital economy, or in the sense of, so how can you think of this without this sort of a contemporary political economy of data production and dissemination?
Great questions. So the first one, I think, yeah, most of this research was done at that point where those organizations, Coursera and edX and Udacity, were sort of coming through. So most of this sort of analysis was of that area, and I think I chose that quite specifically because it seemed to be a kind of moment where higher education institutions, universities, were sort of trying to engage with this idea of the digital. They were sort of jumping on the bandwagon of a mainstream idea of digital education that was being promoted in many sort of problematic ways as this kind of globalized solution to the sort of problems of education. So that, I thought that particular moment was a good moment to try and do that kind of analysis. But I agree that it's also very interesting to look at some of the experiences that students have had on those courses. And I think completion rates is one of them. Some of those maps that I did show were examples of research on some of the early MOOCs. So they were showing enrollments, and I think some of those same teams were involved in producing later statistics on kind of completion rates. So I think that's a good way to look at another way to look at the inequalities, because and I think you're right, these organizations are now trying to monetize MOOCs, because I think they both Coursera and Udacity, being born of the sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneurialist kind of mode, they are interested in monetizing what they do, and they've done a sort of classic social media strategy, where you offer it for free, you get as many people enrolled as you can, you get their email addresses they're built into the promotional machinery, and then you work out ways to monetize it later. I mean, that's what Facebook and these other organizations have done. As long as the sort of ethos there is, as long as you've got people, as long as you've got eyes, then you can worry about how to monetize it later on down the line. And I think that's certainly what we're seeing with verified certificates, which are these questionable means of paying for, and you're not actually paying for the educational experience, you're paying to prove who you are. And I think Coursera for a while were doing this by holding up your passport picture to a webcam. So it was a very, very loose and sort of problematic idea about proving who you are. And I think the latest one is specializations. So what they're doing is putting together a series of MOOCs into a sort of sequential program for which you get a better certificate, and that certificate costs more money. So there's definitely an interesting bit of work to be done there, because I think, in many of those ways you're describing, I think one of them is those specializations are mostly in particular kind of disciplinary areas. They're mostly in data analytics, business, those sorts of things. So there's a drive for these MOOCs to coalesce around particular ideas of education. I think they're moving towards kind of job training. We've already seen that with Udacity, who started out as an organization a bit like Coursera. They never explicitly affiliated themselves with particular institutions, but the instructors did that. And then famously, Sebastian Thrun, some of you might know this, sort of backtracked on his claims. I think he made these sort of wild claims in the media that there would only be 10 higher education institutions in the world or something like that in a few years after MOOCs. And of course he backtracked on that and sort of said publicly, well, I was wrong. And Udacity turned into a kind of online training, largely for coding, data analytics, those sorts of Silicon Valley areas. So yeah, I think that's exactly, it's another way we can understand spatially where these courses are coming from, but also the kind of people they're attracting, the kind of people they're enrolling.
It's still next, thank you.
Just to pick up on what you just said, I think that I think some of these like Coursera and edX, I think they're almost preparing themselves for a kind of a post-institutional world. And it's interesting how they've only gone to the top institutions to kind of to get their knowledge, which they can then broadcast. And you had a nice diagram there of all the institutions in North America, basically, in Europe, and all the places that they're sending their knowledge to, which is quite interesting. I think there's a couple of points I would make. I would say on the Udacity, I think they may be in some ways better at responding to the fast-paced technology changes, maybe better than higher education institutions themselves, better than maybe our computing department, but it's not, I don't know, just leave that one there. But the other thing that I was thinking about is about what's kind of actually happening. So when you're kind of talking about this broadcast pedagogy, and I think what's interesting for me is about the connections that are actually happening there, the social networks that are actually forming through the MOOC and through the sort of the knowledge that's being, as well as broadcast, is actually being created as well through the social aspects of the MOOC. I didn't hear you talk very much about the social aspects of the MOOC. We kind of looked at these videos of, I'm on a hill and I'm in a country where we've still got big monitors and all this kind of thing. But actually, what they might say to each other, what they might say to each other is actually, for me, one of the more interesting points of having a course which is so large, as opposed to having smaller courses that you might run through an institution traditionally.
Yep, I think those are great points. Let me get back to the first one. Yes, I agree. There's been sort of contractual elitism. There's been cases of that. I think there was one, I think it was the University of Michigan maybe, who exposed Coursera's contractual elitism. They published the contract online because, of course, Coursera asked these organisations sometimes, I think certainly in the early days, were asking institutions not to make that public. I think in that document it said very specifically that they wanted to only have a relationship with sort of top tier. I think they had some way of judging institutions in the US. So there's definitely an elitism, certainly in the early days, and that's, I think, from where that diagram is from, that really shows where those institutions were located. There's a number of things there. There was also an interesting case between institutions that were partnering with these organizations. There was a famous one with Michael Sandel's Philosophy 101 at Harvard, which I think I think it was the University of Southern California, where I think they had partnered with Coursera and they were asked to use his Philosophy 101 in their campus-based teaching. It's a kind of blended learning thing. And they made this sort of public resistance. They wrote an open letter to their provost, sort of protesting about this idea that Harvard's Philosophy 101 is better than ours, so we're just going to use it as an efficiency saving. So there's an interesting kind of resistance between institutions as well. But I think your final point is exactly right. I think this was aimed at those early days of MOOC promotion, and I think it is now. It's much more interesting to see what has happened after these high-level MOOCs have sort of come about. The one thing, the way I liked that was put was Bonnie Stewart. I don't know if anybody knows Bonnie Stewart. Is quite a prominent sort of figure in connectivism. In one of her articles, she wrote about MOOCs as a Trojan horse. I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. Although there are maybe these sort of problematic ways of viewing what they were trying to do in their corporate promotion, that actually, as a result of them bringing digital education into the mainstream, attracting lots of students, creating communities that may have been watching video lectures but were also communicating with each other, that has brought in, through the back door, in this Trojan horse, perhaps other ways of thinking about what the richness of what digital education might be. So I absolutely agree, and I think that's the conversation that should be happening around MOOCs, that now that these things are sort of a few more years down the line. And I think, your last point about the massiveness, I think that's something I've tried to make a case for, is sort of preserving courses as having a large enrollment. So I think there is something sort of rich and interesting about the fact that diverse sets of people come together. And they might not all complete, might not all finish, depending on they are, but they have come together, and you have a dynamic that happens at scale which you don't within smaller groups. And that's one of the other things I've tried to make a case for, as a sort of, I think what we're seeing now is a move away from massiveness. We're seeing institutions claiming SPOCs, small private online courses, a reduction of that, or things that try to take away that idea of a big dynamic of students.
Great. I think we've just got time for one more
Sorry,
question.
I'm probably answering.
It's all right.
too long.
That's fine. Thank you for the presentation. Can I just go back to your theoretical framework that you used? It looks like a lot of complex ideas to hear, and then I admit that MOOCs itself is too complex. There should be a lot of narrative that we can get out of research using that particular lens. But after listening to your presentation, I almost have quite a conflicting ideas about what you are trying to say about MOOCs using that particular theoretical lens. It's almost like MOOCs itself is kind of fostering humanism in a certain way, but MOOCs itself is a good example of the era of posthumanism. It's not only human beings kind of regulating that education practice. So can I ask you to give us a summary sentence of what is special about your theoretical framework and what you apply?
I think you're right, and I think I was sort of trying to do both things. I think I was trying to show that the sort of corporate promotion, at a level of corporate promotion, MOOCs, I think certain MOOCs were adhering to particular ideas of humanism that I find quite problematic, sort of model of a single idea of what humanness is and promoting that globally. But at the same time in doing that, it was sort of in a way that this question that highlighted, whilst doing that, it's opened up lots of other ways of thinking about what it is to participate in higher education, what it means to be absent, what it means to be present, what it means to work with software that isn't human and isn't social straightforwardly. So it does open up opportunities to think about education in ways that aren't just adhering to those quite narrow humanist kind of ideals. That was a couple of sentences.
Right. Thank you very much for coming and giving such a great presentation. So if we could just thank Jeremy.